I want to pass over to you. I just want to see, have we got Chris Giancarlo with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, good. Yes, yes, perfectly. God, you scared me. You kind of popped through a window there. No, normally it was a conversation between the two of you. Okay, then let's start, and I can take over. So, Farrah, we start with you and have a conversation, and then I might just take it with you, Chris, for a little bit longer after that, because Farrah has to run out after a while, which I didn't know.
Fabulous. Great.
So, Chris, obviously lots happened in the U.S. You want me to start in terms of what the developments have been, and then you can.
Yeah, that would be great, Faryar.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of questions about what's happening in the U.S. and the way I talk about it is there are essentially three lanes of activity that are worth watching that are going to generate a lot of activity. The first one that the industry is very much focused on is what to do about how to get legislation done, which has been consistently the number one issue that the industry has been pushing for a variety of reasons, including to provide a permanent, clear regulatory path for crypto market intermediaries to be able to operate and to preempt state law, which in the U.S. is becoming a complication on crypto markets, and also to avoid some of the politicization of the crypto policies as we saw in the Biden administration. And with that, there's going to be, may have been a press conference just as we have spoken with some of the congressional leaders and the key White House official, David Sachs, talking about.
I think it's still 2 hours ahead. I think it's at 1:30. So.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So there's going to be.
Thanks,
so
Chris.
we'll get a lot of clarity on legislation. The second piece is the regulators are engaging in a very active process of trying to essentially do what a normal regulator would do: create open dialogues, task forces, roundtables, stakeholder outreach, notice and consultation periods. And so you'll see substantively agencies trying to undo some of the most egregious things that the Biden people did against the crypto sector, but also at the same time implement process improvements so that there's a much more transparent kind of healing process with regard to the engagement of the regulators and the industry. The final piece, and then I'll turn to Chris to talk, is there's a number of court cases that are going to force agency actions much more imminently than they probably had planned. Ironically enough, the Coinbase case that was brought against the SEC is almost at a deadline where the SEC has to decide whether they support or oppose our company's request for an appellate review of some critical legal findings that the trial court made in the case that the SEC brought against us. The deadline for the SEC to respond whether they support or oppose that appeal is February 14th. Normally, if it was Gensler in charge, they would oppose it. Now, with a friendly crypto-friendly administration in place, there's any number of outcomes that could happen, including potentially the agency even withdrawing the cases. We don't anticipate that as the base case, but at minimum, you would think there might be some sort of time delay to give them time to decide how to proceed. So a lot of actions across three lanes. Chris?
Yeah, Faryar, thank you. It's always good to be with you, Faryar. And let me just say also, Nickolas, what a pleasure it is to follow Stephen Mayor and Jean-Paul Servet, former colleagues. Faryar dove quite quickly into what's happening on the crypto front, and I think it's an excellent summary. There's more to come, as he mentioned, at 1:30 p.m. U.S. time today. The new crypto czar, David Sachs, along with a number of U.S. key legislators, are going to be putting forward the administration's crypto legislative and executive branch program on crypto. I thought, however, I might sort of take a broader lens for your audience, as Alex requested. The approach here is what to expect from Trump 2. And I thought I might just sort of review very quickly the extent of the new administration's hold on power and what I think it might mean not only for crypto, but I think for finance, for digital finance, and actually for economic growth and healthy competition between the United States and Europe. You know, the point that needs to be remembered about the Trump victory in November was it really was what people in betting markets call a trifecta. It was a victory for all three branches of government. Of course, he took both houses of Congress, and in terms of his presidential victory, won both the popular vote and the electoral vote. And the third branch of government, or judiciary, is already, at least at the Supreme Court level, in the hands of like-minded conservatives. So his win is really quite broad-based. And as a political comeback, I mean, one can only think about wins by de Gaulle or Churchill in the European context for the type of comeback victory this was after all that was done to Trump, whether it was the impeachment claims or false claims with the Steele dossier and pretty much prosecution by his own government. It's really more than, I would say, just a run-of-the-mill presidential win, but really a political realignment. It's a rejection of the Obama coalition that has more or less ruled U.S. politics for the last 20 years or so. He received very strong support from minorities and recent immigrants. Trump Republicanism is enjoying its highest popularity right now, with Democrats at their lowest level of popularity that we've seen in a generation. And it really signifies a loss of faith in elites, experts. Traditional news media really took a hit in this. State security agencies, big pharma. And it's the creation of a populist movement, I believe, with global appeal. It's pro-nationalism, pro-growth, pro-domestic manufacturing over consumerism, energy self-sufficiency, peace through military and economic strength, very pro-law and order. It's anti-open migrancy, anti-net zero, anti-crime, anti-social division, anti-inflation, anti-globalism. And so these are significant changes in what we might consider the sort of last 20 years world order. Now, what to expect domestically? Well, I think we're going to see, as we're already seeing now, a furious focus on cutting government expenditures, especially by NGOs, and a focus on turbocharging the U.S. economy. Growth, looking at economic growth as the principal path out of national debt. And there's really four elements to that. Increasing energy production to become the world's largest energy producer. And that's both an offensive and defensive purpose, because it's expected that his tariff policy, which I'll come to in a minute, is going to result in tariffs against U.S. agriculture. But by lowering energy costs, it's hoping to offset those retaliatory tariffs. A spur to economic and technology development, everything from not only digital assets, but artificial intelligence, semiconductors, drone technology, nano and biotechnology, quantum computing, et cetera. Ease of capital formation, a real new emphasis on the Securities Exchange Commission and my former agency, the CFTC, for their roles in capital formation and risk transfer, and away from pursuit of social policy, whether that be sustainability or net zero. And then finally, a focus on tax reduction and transition to external revenue generation, which is tariffs, which is really the issue that I think is going to be very challenging for the EU, and something that I'm going to want to speak about later on. But at this point, let me turn back to Faryar, and then later on, Nickolas, when it's appropriate, I'd like to talk about the tariff issue.
Sure.
Yeah, I think Chris drawing the aperture out is actually a good one, and I think it's important to maybe I'll add some comments to what Chris said. I would say in terms of foreign policy, there's a lot that people hear about Trump talking quite aggressively about his posture towards other countries, often allies, which can be obviously very disconcerting for a lot of people who hear that. I would say one thing that's kind of a common thread with Trump is that he has a very strong aversion to ongoing military conflict, and I think you'll see a very strong move on his part, and you've already seen it in terms of the pressure he tried to exert in the Israel-Gaza situation to have some sort of ceasefire reached, some of the hostages released, and to have some lessening of the combatant activity there. I think his approach will be similar to Ukraine. And I think that's important for people to keep in mind, because you hear a lot of language out of Trump that people perceive to be quite aggressive. But his posture is actually probably of our recent presidents, probably the one that's most averse to military conflict when it can be avoided, and most prone to pressuring an outcome that diffuses a military conflict when one is happening. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other is that the Republican coalition that's now ruling the House, Senate, and the White House is seized with the size of the government debt. I think they view it as an existential crisis, and one that the only solution to which is to accelerate growth. And so there's going to be a very aggressive push by Trump to promote economic growth, largely through deregulation and tax cuts and reducing the scale of government. And that's why you're seeing the actions being as aggressive as they are, because I think they perceive it as something that they need to engineer quite quickly so that they can catalyze the economic growth that then catalyze the tax revenues that ultimately are able to pay down the debt. The debt service obligations of the United States now outpace the amount of money that the U.S. spends on defense costs, which is an extraordinary amount, as I think everybody understands. And so it'll animate a great deal of what is happening. The final piece is that there's a very strong degree of nationalism with Trump that you'll see. I think some of this was, predated COVID, but much of it, I think even Europe with strategic autonomy and some of the initiatives that you see in Europe are not that different from what's happening in the U.S. There's a sense that we've been too interconnected from a globalism perspective, that there needs to be more domestic supply chains, particularly for critical sectors of manufacturing. And so you'll see a large emphasis in terms of bringing manufacturing back, and with that, creating more opportunities for the owners of labor. I think much of the trade agenda over the last 20 years in the U.S. or the last 40 years in the U.S. is perceived as to have benefited the owners of capital, has created more efficient allocation of capital in the economy, generated good GDP growth, but that the owners of labor have been left behind. And so there's a bit of and you'll see this with Trump leaning in towards organized labor, attracting a lot of labor voters to his coalition, but also trying to bring onshore much of manufacturing activity and domesticate, bring it into the domestic economy. And I think that's an interesting theme. Now people will perceive these things in tension, and the job of this administration will be to land all of those initiatives that may seem conflicting at times, as cleanly as possible, just given the strategic imperatives that are facing the country.
I know you need to go, but maybe can I just bring it back to the theme of the conference in the sense of, the announcement not to pursue a CBDC, the announcement to potentially get Bitcoin included in the reserve arrangements of the Federal Reserve. Maybe you can say a few words around that.
Yeah, so President Trump made a number of very strong statements on crypto. Two that are worth noting are the ones that you just flagged. One is the U.S. is now unequivocally against the idea of a central bank digital currency. The U.S. concern around it relates to a number of things, particularly relating to kind of the libertarian thread that is still a very heavy part of the American kind of personality and psyche. And so the ability of the government to issue a central bank digital currency, and by virtue of that have the power to engage in not just surveillance of how that money is spent by the American people, but have the ability to create, through smart contract technology, controls over how the money is spent, raises all sorts of concerns on the part of the right side of the U.S. political spectrum. And this is an important issue because there's a lot of work being done globally around the development of national CBDCs in other jurisdictions, and also a big push by the Bank of International Settlement, the IMF, the FSB, and others to create some sort of closed permission network for the future tokenization of the global economy, and that closed network would operate by central bank issued digital currencies. The American opposition to the central bank digital currency also means that vision of a closed network, permissioned only network of that tokenization will be built on is just no longer a viable one. And so there'll have to be a strategic realignment with that, which I think has some sympathy in Europe, particularly among the Commission, I perceive. With regard to the strategic reserve, the U.S. has a strategic reserve of gold. Much of it is the legacy of when the U.S. dollar was backed by gold. What people don't know is there's something, and Chris may know the number of 50, 60, 80 different stockpiles and reserves that the government runs, like plutonium and palladium and cheese and wheat. In fact, when I was a Commerce Department official, I was in charge of the cheese stockpile, believe it or not. So, so not all of these are the same thing as gold. When the executive order was issued by the president, he said he would explore the idea of creating some sort of Bitcoin or digital asset stockpile. We'll see what that ultimately looks like. It has very strong resonance among some supporters of crypto in the industry. I expect that some form of stockpile will be formed, but the scale, the nature of it, where it sits, how it's funded, and how it's ultimately administered, I think is an issue to still undetermined.
Thanks. And do go off.
Okay.
Good. Chris.
I apologize so
no,
much,
not
but thank
at all,
you.
not at all. Chris, let me come back to your point on tariffs. And I want to combine it again with the digital theme a little bit.
Yep.
Because, yeah, say where you think it will go, but it's interesting because we think Europe will respond with the digital services tax or other type of requirements, particularly on the US digital industry, because it's easily targetable and it is by definition largely US.
Right. You know, I'm by the way, I'm a free trader. I'm not a big fan of tariffs, but
I know.
It doesn't matter what my point is. It matters what the administration's point. And I used to think that their approach to tariffs was primarily as a transactional tool, as you've actually seen it used in the last 48 hours with issues about border security between Canada and Mexico. And it served as a very effective transactional tool in those two cases. But I actually really do believe that as I've studied this and I've studied the pronouncements of the administration and spoken to representatives of the administration, I believe they have a broader view of it, not just as a transactional tool, but really as a broader policy. And the policy, I would say, essentially stems from the idea that the United States is the world's largest consumer market, and there should be, in a sense, an entry cost in accessing that market, and a belief that for too long the U.S. has been too open and has not really, in a sense, merchandised its own value proposition by charging for entry to that marketplace. And I think this, in fact, I know this administration is determined to basically putting a price on access to the world's market. And this is where, quite frankly, Europe's own lack of growth, I think, is kind of made this possible. It was, I think, Jean Monnet who said that Europe would eventually be built through crisis, if I have that quote right. I think, in fact, the tariff issue may be the kind of crisis. You know, if we look over just since 2019, U.S. growth has been over 12%. European growth has only been at 5%. I know there's been a recently announced competitive compass, and I think that's probably a good start. But I really think that the tariff issue, which Trump, I think, is going to be very aggressive in using, really will be a challenge that maybe for Europe may be the challenge that's necessary to really spur economic growth. That's my view on that. We could talk about what it might take. I mean, I do think that it might be time really for Europe to relook at market-based finance rather than demagogue it. I spent a lot of time at the FSB during my time, and I heard about market-based finance referred to as shadow finance. We don't refer to it as shadow finance here in the United States. It powers about half of our corporate finance, more so than bank finance, and it's created a very dynamic growth trajectory for our companies. And I think that rather than demagogue it, it might be time for Europe to really get serious about a market union and further that way for its companies to grow. And the other thing I'd say, and I've been listening for the last 2 hours of the conference, some very good presentations, especially by my former colleague and actually dear friend, Jean-Paul Servet. I would say this with the greatest amount of respect to Europe. He asked the question to his audience, what can policymakers do to help innovators? I actually think the answer to that might be do less. If you don't mind my saying this, I think European policymakers have too much influence over innovation, not too little. You know, it's one of my observations of 40 years between the US and Europe is that EU regulation often intends to come before innovation. It almost says to innovators, hold on, we've got a regulation coming out. Once we get that in place, go ahead with your innovation. And the good side of that is it allows what's called the Brussels effect, that other countries importing into Europe have to follow European regulations. But it also means that innovators often innovate to meet the regulation rather than to meet market opportunity. And you know, the criticism of US regulation is it often comes late after the innovation has been done. But the benefit of that is innovators don't innovate to meet a regulation, they innovate to meet a market demand or a market opportunity. And I think that's part of the reason why you've seen so much of the new technological innovations, sadly, not come out of Europe, but come out of the US or increasingly coming out of Asia. I think Europe might want to consider a little bit of a smaller hand for policymakers, let innovation occur, then identify what the real policy needs are, and then input regulation to address the policy needs, as opposed to anticipating policy needs and stifling innovation while regulatory policy is developed in Brussels and then implemented at all the national levels.
Chris, can I, to close, ask you two questions? One is to challenge what you've just said, because actually throughout the day, maybe not so much in the last 2 hours, but throughout the day there was this talk about MiCA having created a legal framework allowing the industry to develop, how good it was that Europe was the leader in this, the same in operational resilience. And now you're saying, actually, no, it would have been better to just let things develop and then do the regulation afterwards. So maybe it'd be interesting to hear your views on that, because now there's excitement that the US will follow with its own regulation. And the second, second one, just at the same time, is you, when you were at the CFTC and when you were here speaking at our conference and so on, you were also at the beginning of mainstreaming crypto assets into financial services through derivatives products, ETF products. What do you think will happen in the US market on that?
So look, I think during the first Trump administration, the U.S. actually was setting the pace globally. We were the first major regulator to create a regulatory framework for Bitcoin in creating Bitcoin futures, fully regulated by the CFTC, and that was back in 2017. Today, that market is deep, it's liquid, it's well regulated, it's fully transparent, and I think it was an example of good leadership. Now, 2017, Bitcoin was already on the world stage for at least 9 years, and the CFTC had been studying it since at least 2014, 2015. And so I think when we put regs in place in 2017, it was not ahead of the innovation, but it was in pace with the innovation. The next 4 years, especially the last 2 years under the Biden administration, the United States really lost its way. Innovators fled the United States. I think it gave Europe a great opportunity to adopt MiCA and attract regulation. And at the time, I told regulators in Europe and elsewhere that go as quickly as you can, because when the United States door swings, suddenly it's going to swing wide open. And in fact, it hasn't only swung wide open, Trump has kicked it down. He's determined to make the United States the crypto capital of the world. And if you combine that with the size of the US market, if we can get some smart regulation with the natural pace of innovation, I think some of his dreams in that area can be realized. But smart regulation is critical. You know, now crypto's been on the scene long enough that we can understand the public policy, certainly issues that we face at the CFTC about curbing fraud and manipulation are clear to see. There's still way too much of that in this market, and we need to fix that. But other innovations like AI, for example, I think are still quite nascent. We still don't fully know. We can speculate, but I don't think we fully know about some of the public policy imperatives. And there, I think policymakers might want to wait a little bit, slow down, and let innovators innovate, and let's really see not just what we think might be some of the risks, but really are the risks. We all want to do right, but sometimes we need to let a little bit of harm actually occur so we can actually understand it and then regulate it. Now, I face this frequently in my own work in regulation. It's a fine balance. If regulators get too far ahead, you actually wind up stifling the innovation. If you get too far behind, you let too much harm go. I think there's a balance, and I think sometimes regulators need to just hold back a little bit, let the innovation take place, study it, understand what are the true public policy imperatives. And often those imperatives are not to control every aspect of the innovation, but to control discrete areas where there's a public policy harm or a public policy imperative to be achieved.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. I know you're also on the clock and have to do another event shortly. But thank you so much for you and Faryar in opening a window, in your case actually looking at the screen, literally a window into the Trump administration, which I think is very helpful for us here in Europe, and hopefully see you in person soon. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.